So my background's in electrical engineering. I grew up in Indiana. I had a choice of going to Ball State University and studying telecommunications or Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology to study engineering. I decided to go the engineering route and then started to then work on the F-22 Raptor and Northrop Grumman, so doing like high technology stuff, but at night producing films and movies. And so I always had this kind of art and science dialectic in my life. And I feel like virtual reality gives me an opportunity to talk at the cutting edge of technology, but also the cutting edge of art and aesthetics and what's happening in the future of immersive storytelling. And so I just had a passion for understanding what are the affordances of this new medium of virtual reality. And as we have Meta that has all these different technologies, and then Apple coming out with Apple Vision Pro, this paradigm shift into spatial computing, I felt like moving from 2D to 3D was this huge platform shift that only happens once every 7 or 14 years or so, but this one seemed like a pretty significant one that I really wanted to document pretty comprehensively, and that's what I've been doing with the Voices of VR podcast since 2014. So I'm going to be doing in 2 major parts. I'm going to be talking a lot about the affordances of virtual reality, of how I think about experiential design and immersive storytelling through the perspective of quality, story, character, and context. A lot of my work of covering the frontiers of immersive storytelling at the film festivals, from like Sundance to South by Southwest to Tribeca Immersive to Venice Immersive to IFA Doc Lab. I try to go to each of these different immersive storytelling locations and see all the work, and then try to talk to as many of the different creators as I can. And I've done interviews with hundreds of different immersive storytellers over the last nearly 10 years now. And then I'll be talking about the promises and perils of XR. That's where it gets into more of the ethical and moral dilemmas of XR, and I've done a lot of work on that as well. And I'll sort of give a little bit of my framework to help understand the scope. And as people are thinking about artificial intelligence, there's just talking to people before they started, they said there's not been another technology that has been so disruptive as to thinking about education and how people are using these new technologies, and virtual reality and artificial intelligence are really sibling technologies that are working with each other. And as we move forward, a lot of the ways that we're going to be delivered AI is through these immersive and interactive experiences where we're having conversation interfaces with virtual beings. So this is a whole other new domain that hopefully this will be a presentation that helps to set a broad context for you to help understand what's happening with the media and where it's going in the future. All right, so let's start with the experiential design and immersive storytelling framework that I use. So there's this quote from Robert McKee that I really love. He says, "True character is revealed in the choices a human being makes under pressure. The greater the pressure, the deeper the revelation, the truer the choice to the character's essential nature." The way that I start to understand this is that when you watch a piece, a film or story, what you're seeing is that someone's placed within a context, they're being put under pressure, they're making choices and taking action, and then you're seeing some of their essential character that's being revealed. And so this is happening over these unfolding processes over time. Now, usually when you're watching a 2D media, you're watching other people's stories, but in immersive media, it's you who are the interactive there, who are being forced to be put in these contexts and make choices and take actions. And maybe at the end of it is part of your essential character that's being revealed as you're coming out of this immersive experience. So to kind of break it down, there's context, quality, character, and story. And I'll be kind of talking about each of these 4 different dimensions. So let's start with quality. So presence is probably the one thing that people, as they do a virtual reality experience, they talk about being transported into another place. And I just remember going to Oculus Connect 1 back in 2014, and this CTO or CEO of Oculus at the time, Brendan Irbay, on a tech stage talking about these qualities of presence, something that I hear from like Buddhism and these spiritual communities now all of a sudden is at the frontiers of immersive technologies. And so Mel Slater is a brilliant researcher who's tried to break this down into 2 primary illusions, the place illusion and the plausibility illusion. The place illusion is the illusion that you're actually in a place despite knowing that you're not actually there. And the plausibility illusion is that you believe that it's actually happening even though you know that it's not actually happening. I take some issue with this kind of illusionary language, per David Chalmers, who argues that virtual reality is an actual and genuine reality rather than an illusionary reality. But that's more of a philosophical discourse that we could talk more about offline. But the way I like to think about it is in these different qualities of presence. You have active presence, mental and social presence, emotional presence, and embodied and environmental presence. These are all the phenomenological experiences as you have an immersive experience, and there's these different qualities and ways that you're interacting with it. And I think a good way to kind of start to dive into it is to look at existing communication media. So you have video games, which is all about agency and interactivity, and you're actually making choices and you're expressing your will to explore, and that's more of the active presence. You have mental and social presence, which is a lot about the mental constructs and mental models and schemas and language that we use to be able to both understand experiences and suspension of disbelief, but also the way to communicate through language, through social interactions with other people, through literature and books, but also social media, the way we've used these technologies to create these new mass communication platforms. And then you have the emotional presence, which is film, which is a lot more of you receiving a story and having the building and releasing of tension through editing. And it's really these contrasts between consonance and dissonant cycles that are really designed to modulate your emotions. And you have music as well as mood and lighting that are there. And then we have virtual and augmented reality, which is in this embodied and environmental presence. It's like these new domains where we're starting to pull in aspects of architecture and theater and dance and theme park design and sensory experiences that, it's giving you the sense of embodiment of now all of a sudden your sense of self are being put into these media. And so again, it's about taking action, making choices, emotional immersion, and sensory experience. Now we can start to look at how there's been each media and there's subsequent media where we have oral storytelling to theater, books, film, radio, TV, video games, internet, mobile phone, and then VR, AR, and immersive theater. And each subsequent media is encompassing all the other previous media. And I think that you can see like video games has like a center of gravity of agency, so it's red. And so each of these will have like a center of gravity of the new affordance that it's really centered in. And you can see that the VR, AR, and immersive theater is really bringing these new dimensions of embodiment and environmental design into all these other aspects of media. Now, this is, for me, I'm really leaning upon this kind of elemental approach of fire, air, water, and earth, and looking at these different archetypal dimensions of these elements. And leaning on also Jung, who talked about the archetypes in the collective unconscious, where he talked about archetypes that cannot be reduced down to a simple formula. And I'm going to read this little passage just to give you a little bit of flavor. He says that clear-cut distinctions and strict formulations are quite impossible in this field, seeing that a kind of fluid interpenetration belongs to the very nature of all archetypes. They can only be roughly circumscribed at their best. Their living meaning comes out of more of their presentation as a whole than a single formulation. Every attempt to focus them more sharply is immediately punished by the intangible core of meaning losing its luminosity. No archetype can be reduced to a simple formula. It is a vessel which can never be empty and never fill. It has a potential existence only, and when it takes shape and matter, it no longer what it was. It persists throughout the ages and requires interpreting ever anew. The archetypes are the imperishable elements of the unconscious, but they change their shape continually. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk about that is because it's like this, kind of, you think about it as a diamond, a multifaceted diamond where there's many different faces. And so, but it's also like this girdle incompleteness where it's incomplete. It's not, there's never going to be a simple formula. It's always going to be ever expanding. It's always going to be listening to new ways that these archetypes are being manifested throughout culture over time. And it's through that archetypal approach that, for me, whenever I look at the academic literature, it seems like there's like a million different theories of presence, but they're all kind of saying the same thing. And it was really frustrating to me because I just wanted to kind of make sense of what, for me, was a baseline of my own phenomenological experiences of these experiences. So I'm going to read through some of the different ways that I start to think about these different qualities of presence, just to give you a sense of these archetypal potentialities. But throughout the course of this presentation, I'll also be kind of talking about some of the other ones. So active presence, all about agency and interactions, the dynamics, the actions, locomotion, exploration, spontaneity, creativity, will, engagement, gameplay, intention, and live performance. Mental and social presence, all about thoughts, language, choices, expectations, and novelty, mental models, plausibility, coherence, attention, suspension of disbelief, puzzles, mental friction, rules, social presence, and virtual beings. Emotional presence, all about emotional immersion, feelings, mood, vibe, color, lighting, consonance and dissonance cycles, music, story, time, flow, narrative presence, empathy, and compassion. And then a body presence, all about self-presence, body, embodiment, sensory experience, biometric and physiological data, brain-computer interfaces, neural inputs, haptics, immersive sound, spatial presence, environmental immersion, and architecture. So that gives you a little bit of flavor, each of these. And so all of these are all kind of happening all at once, and some of the experiences will really be leaning into one or the other, and sometimes they'll be kind of stacked as to which experience they're kind of prioritizing one thing over another. And they're context switching between all of these as you go through the course of an experience. So Mel Slater, he had this idea of the place illusion, a plausibility illusion, which didn't, for me, really encompass all these other dimensions of presence. You can think about it as the plausibility illusion. For me, is like the mental, presence of like believing and having, your suspension of disbelief. But then the place illusion is really about that kind of environmental presence. But then later in 2022, he started to expand his definitions, and he added two things, including the co-presence illusion as well as the body ownership illusion. So you have the plausibility and co-presence, where you start to give the social dimensions, but also the place illusion and the embodiment, but still no things about agency or emotions. So again, you have active presence, mental, social presence, emotional presence, and embodied environmental presence. So as I started to look at what was out there, I asked a presence researcher, hey, have you come across anything that sounds a little bit like this? And he said, oh, actually, Dustin Chertoff tried to do this thing back in like 2010, where his PhD, he was looking at experiential marketing. He was looking from the advertising world. And experiential design originated from the marketing field, where it was used to encourage people to create meaningful, emotional, and social connections to a product. And they had sensory, cognitive, affective, active, and relational. And so when I sort of split that out as active, cognitive, relational, affective, and sensory, it was a pretty one-to-one correlation to what was coming from literature from 10 years prior than what I was even aware of as I was starting to flesh this out. And then there is these experiential marketing modules, these strategic experiential marketing modules from 1999, which is sense, feel, think, act, and relate, which is act, think, and relate, feel, and sense. And then you have measuring brand experiences from 2009, sensory, affective, behavioral, intellectual, affective, and sensory. So you can start to see even like from the learning theory, there's cognitive skills, affective skills, psychomotor skills, and embodied cognition. So you have the psychomotor domain, cognitive domain, affective domain, and then embodied cognition. And then when I go to the International Joint Conference of International Artificial Intelligence, I've done about 200 interviews about AI with researchers trying to make sense of what's happening in AI. And there's things like multi-based and multi-agent systems, and then a lot of it is in the AI element of knowledge representation and reasoning, natural language processing, planning and scheduling, constraint satisfaction, optimization, multidisciplinary topics and applications, humans and AI, search and uncertainty, and then AI ethics, trust, fairness, AI for good, AI arts, and emotional detection, and then the computer vision, machine learning, and robotics. That's where you get a lot of the neural networks that are kind of mimicking the way that our brain works to be able to have these new ways of parallel processing to make sense of, with computer vision and machine learning, this parallel processing that is really suited for like GPUs. That is kind of a different paradigm that is more experiential based, where you train the data rather than write algorithms in a heuristic. So there's also Richard Skarbez, who has a whole survey of different presence concepts from 2017, and I started to try to list those out. I'm not going to read all of these things, but you can look at them in the slides to refer to them later. But and there's also things he has in that don't fit into the schema, and this is all very subjective as well. But the point is that I'm trying to make sense of like a framework to have as I start to understand this media. So again, active presence, mental, social presence, emotional presence, and embodied environmental presence. Okay, so I did a whole hour-long talk on this as a topic where I go into much more detail than I'm going here. If you want to see that, there's a talk on YouTube where you can dive into more detail with more sort of the evolution of this. So I just went to Venice Immersive, where there were 43 immersive projects. I saw all of them and then did 30 hours of coverage over 35 interviews that I recorded on site and then published. And then so there's a whole, applying this framework to what's happening at the bleeding edge of immersive storytelling that I just published, starting from 1272 up to 1305 of episodes. And then kind of had just like a spreadsheet to see how there's different contexts, and there are these things about war and different things about identity, and so just looking at the contextual domains, but also you see that I have like 4 layers of like, what is the primary center of gravity? Is it more of an embodied and immersive experience? Is it more of a game? Is it more of a puzzle or an idea that you're trying to communicate? Or is it more of a cinematic piece? And so each of the different creators, whether they're coming from the cinematic world or the game design world, they'll have like you walk away saying, this is more like a game, but there's these other components. And so as I do my interviews, that's how a lot of ways that I'm starting to kind of step through and making sense of what people were able to achieve with these different projects that they're creating. So there's a whole 3.5 hour breakdown that I did with 3 other immersive critics, where we talked about all 43 stories, where we start to also talk more about the characters and the stories, but also the different qualities of presence. So you can also look at that at episode 1305, just to get a sense of what's happening at the frontiers of immersive storytelling. Okay, so that's context, quality, character, and story. So we talked about quality. Let's move on to story. I'm just going to grab my water. 1 second. All right, so when we think about the spectrum of story authorship, so most traditional media is an authored story. You watch it, and there's nothing that you do as watching it that changes how the story is told. You can have 100 people watch it, and they pretty much see the same thing. Well, once you start getting into more interactive and generative media, when you have the ability for the audience to make choices, then you have a whole variety of different possibility spaces that people may experience. And so you get more into this generative space, which is more about maximizing someone's agency or their will as they're going through that experience. And so there's a lot of different story structures that you can do that kind of take people across the spectrum. So Lebowitz and Klug had this interactive storytelling spectrum where they go from authored narrative, generative narrative. So just to kind of quickly go through those, you have the traditional 3-act structure that I'm sure everybody in this room is well versed into how to construct these traditional Aristotelian 3-act story. And then you have an interactive traditional story where you have like maybe a choice that someone makes, but then it converges back. And so everyone pretty much gets the same experience, but it's slightly flavored in different ways. So it's a way of giving light levels of interactivity and agency, but not really anything meaningful that's changing the story that you're getting. And then you get into the full branching path stories where every choice that you give somebody, it kind of splits off into a completely different story. So every choice you give someone exponentially increases the amount of work that you have to do as an authored narrative author to kind of create all those different strands. But then once you get into more of a sandbox style with open-ended stories, then it becomes a little bit more like a video game. It's difficult as a storyteller to have telling the beats of a story and as an editor really controlling how that time-based media unfolds. Once you go into this generative, then you kind of put agency into the control of the user, and that kind of disrupts that normal flow of how stories are told, which means it's difficult to really control the narrative, but it becomes more about these possibility spaces that people are exploring, which is what Facade did with the drama manager, which is that they had tracking of what choices people are making, and then they tried to give the best story depending on different stories different choices that people are making throughout the course of the story. So that's a way of kind of blending these two dialectics, because it's either you're giving the user a lot of agency or you're telling the story and you're having them listen to it rather than taking action. And then you get into the fully player-driven stories, which I think we're moving into, where it's like these possibility and probability spaces, and even using large language models with AI virtual agents, where you're just using the stochastic model of this kind of average of all of the language that's on the internet, where people are kind of exploring these different possibility spaces that the author may have no idea what is actually being said. And we're starting to see some of those different types of stories in the context of Venice with a piece called Tulpomancer, where you would actually enter in some prompts and they would create a virtual reality experience in a story that only you would listen to, and then when you're done, they would destroy it. So it's something that was a very specific immersive experience that was only created for one individual. So you're starting to get into this kind of world where you're having very bespoke experiences that are created by generative AI. So you have this dialectic between the passive experience, where you have, from the quantum metaphor, you have particle-like actuals, where there's like one thing that's made manifest, and then you have the other end where you have to create these dynamic waves of potentiality, where you're creating these possibility spaces for people to explore. All right, so that's a story. The character, where this is where the essential character is revealed, and like I said, you can look at it through Vogler's character arc, where there's like a journey that the character is going through that kind of maps over to the Campbell's hero's journey as you go through these different phases. But again, there's this fundamental question: is whose characters are being revealed? Are you watching other people make choices and take action, so it's more of a traditional media? Or are you the protagonist that's actually the embodied character, that your choices that you're making is all of a sudden your essential character is being revealed as you're coming out of the experience? So are you a ghost, or are you do you have impact of the story? Devin Dolan started to map this out, where you could either be a passive ghost where you're invisible, you're just watching it and you don't have any impact, or maybe you are a character but you don't have any impact, or maybe you're a ghost with impact, or the kind of holy grail is that you're a character with impact, which is, I think, where kind of the full extent of where folks within the immersive industry want to get to, where you have an embodiment, you have a character, and the choices you make have some sort of impact for how the story is unfolding. Okay, then you have Westworld, where you have all these different character traits that, as we have these different ways of designing different types of characters, you can look at virtue ethics from these virtue continuum for, the most negative and most positive manifestations of these different virtues. And then you have the big 5 personality characteristics, and then you have the feelings and needs, where you start to think about what are the needs of the characters that are starting to perhaps drive their feelings and also the choices that they're making. So thinking about the character motivation. So, character is a lot of what's happening in literary theory. There's nothing that I've seen yet in the context of VR that's really innovating in character, other than having virtual beings and AI characters and trying to create ways that you have specific domain knowledge for them, where you're able to still control the narrative, but then also allow people to have these interactions with the characters. Now, the last one here, context, really leads into the last section of the ethics, and so I wanted to take a little bit of time to sort of help expand on what I mean by context, because for me, this is a pretty significant aspect of the affordance of virtual, augmented, and mixed reality. All right, so Milgram and Kishino had this real famous mixed reality continuum. I've modified it a little bit and changed it to extended reality spectrum. He had a real environment, and I'm saying it's a physical environment to the virtual environment. So on the one end, there's physical reality, and the other extreme, there's virtual reality. And then, as you move along and you're in the center of gravity of the physical environment as your primary context, and you start to blend in different aspects of augmentation, that's the augmented reality. And then with the Quest 3, we have something that's more of a center of gravity of, like, say, a virtual reality headset that has a video pass-through. And so you have a mixed reality where you have cameras that are showing the world outside of you, but you're still in the baseline of mostly the world, but you have the ability to kind of blend into even more aspects of the virtual environment. And then you have the fully virtual VR. So AR is modifying your existing context. You're still in the center of gravity of that context, and VR is able to do a complete context switch. So you're going into another domain, another world. So you can, like, add information around where your keys are and give a little metadata on top of that, or you can just do this complete switch into another reality. So Meta is working on something they call contextually aware AI, which is, for me, brings up one of the biggest ethical questions, because they essentially want to create this AI that's paying attention to everything all the time, for everything you do, always. And that's sort of dystopic, but this is what they're openly saying they want to do. Just as an example, they're like, oh, you've already added enough salt. I wonder, if anybody's cooked, like, how does the computer actually know if you've added enough salt? Is it like, it's something that it's sort of probably created by people who don't actually cook. But anyway, it's the idea. They have another example here. Where did I put grandma's watch? The idea would be that this augmented reality would be tracking everything you ever do, and then it would know that you put grandma's watch in this one specific location, and it tells you where it's at. Again, this is sort of like a dystopic thing, but they're openly having these different things like Ego 4D, which is really pushing the limits of what they call egocentric point of view capture and contextually aware AI. They have a number of these different benchmarks that you can look at on their website. So there's like these 5 major categories of episodic memory. They're trying to answer the question, what happened when? Forecasting, what will I do next? Object interactions, what am I doing now and how? AV diarization, who said what and when? And social, how are we interacting? So again, they're trying to create these omnipresent, contextually aware AI that's being able to answer all these questions. Again, they're just trying to sort of ingest all this information. This is kind of like their end game for where they want to take it, which for me, if they want to have contextually aware AI, we have to really understand, okay, what is context and how does context really play into both privacy and ways to push back against the, is this even a good idea? Do we even want this? So Meta sees contextual aware AI as the future of human-computer interaction. They say in one of their blog posts, 2 of the most critical elements are contextual aware AI, that it understands your commands and actions as well as the context and environment around you, and the AI will make deep inferences about what information you might need or things you might want to do in various contexts based on an understanding of you and your surroundings. Now, I can understand that if you go into the living room, maybe there's a little button that says play the stereo, whatnot. That's the kind of idea that they're going to. But again, this is kind of like, are they paying attention when they go to the doctors or the bank? What are the limits of what context they're paying attention to and what kind of interfaces they want to have? There seems to be no limits to this contextual aware AI. So Helen Niesenbaum actually has a whole theory of privacy called contextual integrity. And she says that, rather than trying to shut things down, that there's appropriate flows of information, but it has to be in the right context. So as an example, when I go to a doctor, I tell my doctor information about my health, but I don't tell health information to my bank. So there's certain contextually appropriate information that you tell your banker one information about your finances and you tell your doctor information about your health. And so there's appropriate norms that happen in each of these different contexts. And so contextually integrity is all about understanding what those contexts are and what the norms are for each of those ways that you are transferring information. And contextually aware AI is trying to basically destroy this as a concept. So Nissenbaum's defining context as different social spheres defined by important purposes, goals, and values, characterized by distinctive ontologies, roles, and practices, like healthcare, education, family, norms, including information norms, what happens with each of these different contexts, whether explicit or implicit rules for how information is flowing. And she's asking people, please don't ask me to define context, because the context ends up being this real nebulous thing to really kind of pin down. But it's actually very important. Anybody who studies linguistics knows about pragmatics, which is one way of understanding context. But it's also, I think, as technology moves forward, the affordances of virtual and augmented reality are going to force us to have a deeper understanding of what context is. And so Dr. Anita Allen is one of the founders of philosophy of privacy, and her fourth point here is, as she's trying to come up with a comprehensive philosophy of privacy, she says that context-specific practical applications and implications that demonstrate the explanatory power and import of the accounts defended. In other words, if you're going to have a philosophy of privacy, you have to understand and give examples for how that works out in specific contexts. Again, kind of going back to Helen Nissenbaum's idea. And then Daniel Solove is another philosopher of privacy and lawyer, who he says that privacy should be conceptualized from the bottom up rather than the top down, and from particular contexts rather than the abstract, and that my approach seeks is to be contextual without being overly tied to specific contexts. So again, whenever you think about privacy, context is really quite important to really kind of wrapping your mind around it. Now, for me personally, I lean heavily upon process relational thinking, so Alfred North Whitehead and lots of different thinkers from Jung, Hegel, Spinoza, Deleuze, James Hillman, Isabel Singers. So there's a couple of interviews that I've done that are listed here with some process philosophers, with Matt Siegel and Grant Maxwell, that are diving much more deeper. It's way beyond the scope of this talk here, but I wanted to just give a brief sort of overview, because for me, this shift from object-oriented thinking into process relational thinking is one of the key paradigm shifts that I feel like virtual reality and also artificial intelligence is kind of forcing us into this new paradigm. So we're going from one mode of being into this new mode of being, and for me, process relational philosophy kind of starts to identify what that new mode of being is. And in essence, it's based on the premise that being is dynamic, and that the dynamic nature of being should be the primary focus of any comprehensive philosophical account of reality and our place in it. Even though we experience our world and ourselves as continuously changing, Western metaphysics has long been obsessed with describing reality as an assembly of static individuals whose dynamic features are either taking to be mere appearances or ontologically secondary or derivative. In other words, we're obsessed with objects and how they are static, and we're trying to move into seeing how things are more in this dynamic flux, so more of the Heraclitus idea of like, you can only step into the river once because both the river is changing and us as people are changing. So substance metaphysics is that the basic building blocks of reality are these kind of stuff that's been actualized. And process relational metaphysics is like the building blocks are processes, potential, and relationships. The best way, in some ways, to kind of make sense of it from a scientific perspective is in quantum mechanics, where there's a wave function, and then the wave function collapses and it actualizes. That's sort of the object. That's where things begin. But there's all these other stuff, all these math structures of these probabilities, and the way that that's resolved mostly in the Western way is that all those possibilities are manifest in orthogonal parallel universe in every kind of the multiverse idea in Everett's many worlds that are orthogonal and we can't see them, but every possibility is actualized in another parallel world that we can't see. Or the other is to say that all those different possibilities are actually real, and that you just have to say the building blocks of reality are deeper than that, into the stuff. It's into these processes, potential, and relationships, and these whole part relations of event sequences. So this is something that comes up a lot, where I'm trying to see what's, decolonization theory or different aspects of identity. There's all these things that are kind of moving into, the philosophy of biology and thinking about consciousness. There's moving into more of these seeing how things are these processes. Also experiential design, something that happens, the process that happens over time. So Site says that processes have a mereological structure. What's that mean? Well, mereology is essentially that there's part-hood relationships and that there's the relationship to the part and the whole. That's a word that, this graphic for me is a way that I start to make sense of it, where there's atoms that are in the context of molecules and organelles and cells and tissues and organs. So this idea that there's these wholes and parts that are interacting with each other, and context is starting to say that we're able to expand our ideas of these relational dynamics of context. Why is this important? Well, virtual reality as a medium is able to preserve a lot of those relational contextual dynamics, where after you see an experience, you're able to understand the relational dynamics in a way that actually puts you there, rather than seeing it in 2D abstraction, which is part of the affordance of the medium that I'm seeing people are taking advantage of in different ways. Timothy Eastman wrote a book called Untying the Gordian Knot, and he says that real world interactions always involve context. So whenever you do any type of measurement, you have input, output, and context. So you can never have an objectified number in absence of the relation for how that number was gathered. And that's sort of the point. It goes all the way down to when you make an observation and quantum ontology, all the way up to science when you have numbers and you publish them, but that's part of the reason why there's a peer review process, is because you have to see if all the proper relational dynamics were maintained. So identity is a very socially constructed and contextual. This is from Kalia Young, who is doing a talk on identity and all the different work on identity, and seeing how when you are hanging out with your friends, you share different information than when you hang out with your family, than when you're at work. So the way that who you are and your identity changes across all these different contexts. And Huera has a whole book called Context Changes Everything. And I just want to read this book because this came out from MIT Press in 2023. Saying identity and individuation must be reframed as fluid, yet metastable and persistent dynamic interdependencies forged by constraints in particular contexts and historical moments. The collective properties that irreversibly emerge from such interactions among individuals are inherently relational, reflecting contextually constrained interactions that generated them. Why did I read that big long sentence? Again, identity is connected to both fluid, it's relational, it's contextual, understanding what identity is, you have to look at this deeper context and these things. So virtual reality is kind of bringing all these things in there that we have to start to understand some of these different aspects to understand why do people want to have different avatar representations across different contexts, and what's it mean to go between different groups. So, and then also intersectional axes of privilege, domination, and oppression, where you have, from on the top, the things that typically have a lot of power in our society, being young, attractive, there's white, male. These things on the bottom are things, folks who are marginalized communities who have traditionally dealt with a lot of oppression, resistance, gender deviant, female, people of color, non-European, Aboriginal, LGBTQ plus IA, persons with disabilities, and on, where essentially, understanding that with each of these technologies, you have to understand these different power dynamics. And if you're creating an immersive experience, sometimes you can take a feminist perspective, and that is a completely different way of kind of understanding and reading it that is important to see. And I think this is kind of reflected in literary theory as well, as you start to see how these dimensions of power and privilege are dictating how the stories are being told. In virtual reality, I'm seeing a lot of that in the context of VR, because a lot of ways that you're starting to create a new balance of telling these stories of decolonization or telling stories of oppression in many different facets. It's a theme that comes up again and again and again. All right, a couple more things in context, and we'll move on to the ethics stuff. So world building is a pretty big topic of building worlds, and Alex McDowell, he worked on Minority Report and is famous for building out the world, and then from that world, then they created the story. And there's the individual scale, the family scale, community scale, world scale, the city scale. So as you go out into these different scales, but you have like designing what the governance is and the energy. And so this is not only for trying to build like sci-fi worlds, but it's also just trying to understand our existing world and how all these things are coming together, and virtual reality as a medium to be able to start to explore these alternative worlds that haven't been created yet, but we can have an immersive experience of them. And then also Lessig has a whole pathetic dot theory, where there's cultural norms, the law, the market, technological architecture and code. Whenever there's any ethical issue, it's usually some combination of all of these different things and how they're coming together. I like to put them in sort of a nested context. So you have, at the broadest context, the Earth, and within the context of the Earth, you have culture, then laws, then the economy, and then you start to have the design guidelines, and then the network architecture, XR hardware, operating system, app code, and then finally the user experience. So this is sort of like a stack, XR stack, where as the metaverse is starting to be developed, you have everything that's included in here, including the laws and the culture, but also all the technological aspects. And then finally, we start to look at these different contextual domains. So for me, I am asking people, what's the ultimate potential of VR? They'll say, well, it's about education, entertainment. It's about being with home and family, connecting with friends, being able to express your identity in new ways. So as I've asked at the end of each of my episodes, I ask people this question, the ultimate potential of VR, and they usually answer across one of these different contextual domains. My episode 1000 is like a 3-hour episode that starts to explore this. And then on my website, I've also have categories that start to show how each of these different contextual domains have been playing out. And then when I was at Laval Virtual back in 2019, we started brainstorming ethical issues and all the different ethical moral dilemmas of XR with all these different Post-it notes. And then we had to present it. So how do you sort of condense all these things into some sort of framework? And that's where I said, well, let's see if these kind of map out into different ways of kind of understanding these different contextual domains and how those different ethical dimensions start to play out. And then I expanded it at Augmented World Expo in 2019 and then started to map out these different specific contextual domains. And then I did an XR Ethics Manifesto in 2019 where I basically stood up for a half hour and went through a whole variety of all these ethical and moral dilemmas. And then from that talk, the IEEE came to me and said, let's expand this out into a series of different white papers. So I worked for 2 years, a number of different academics, going through each of these different contextual domains to do whole white papers on virtual clones, identity, business, education, anonymity, privacy, medical, XR, social spaces, and trolling, harassment, and online, metaverse governance, and diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. So this is a whole 14-hour podcast series that I did, and also all these different white papers to kind of dive into each of these different topics. So with that, I'm going to sort of now shift into trying to give the best I can in the last 20 minutes or so an overview of so this Promises and Perils is both what is the possibilities for what this medium can do and what's in the future, but also some of the different perils, some of the ethical and moral dilemmas that are also kind of the same context. They're two sides of the same coin. All right, so take a little drink. Oops. All right, so starting with entertainment, hobbies, and sex, there's gaming and flow states where virtual reality is all about putting you into a flow state and allowing you to express your agency in new and different ways. Then you have exercise in VR, which has been a huge trend of people actually exercising, interacting with each other. Then there's different aspects of exploratory adventure. Immersive storytelling has been a huge part of what the future potential is, and I've been going to a lot of these different film festivals to see how the storytellers have been using the technology to be able to tell stories in new ways. And then you have the holodeck, which is just the idea of generative AI and virtual reality, where you can start to just speak out what you want, and you have whole immersive worlds that are starting to be created out of that, which is already starting to happen with experiences that I saw at Venice Immersive. Artists are blazing new neural pathways by being able to create new immersive experiences that are allowing people to see the world in new ways, creating different creation tools to be able to be in VR and make VR from OpenBrush and Gravity Sketch and all these different ways that you can actually be immersed within the medium of VR and use the tools of VR to create virtual experiences. And then some of the moral dilemmas are escapism and addiction. As you go into these different worlds, then to what degree are you in right relationship to the world around you and all of your different obligations, and how much are you just using the technology to escape into another world? And then adult content and age verification. This is important just because there are some different social VR platforms that have adult content. So if you're having 18 plus different experiences, then how do you prevent people who are underage from engaging in those? And also just kind of creating a dynamic where, there's not sexual predators as well that may be taking place on these different platforms. So medical health is an aspect where virtual reality can start to cure different aspects where people can put on a virtual reality headset and cure their lazy eye. So being able to use the concept of neuroplasticity to be able to use a virtual experience to come out of it, and then from there they're able to actually, so James Blaha and Vivid Vision, he was able to put VR and basically train his weak eye and to be able to see in stereo 3D for the first time. So the fact that you can use virtual reality as a technology to actually, as a medical process. Walter Greenleaf has come up with a taxonomy of all the different ways that XR is being used in the medical field, from all these different ways of being able to address all these different issues. And he breaks it down into a number of different types of categories, from its functional training, objective assessments, improved interventions, facilitated adherence, distributed care delivery, and then prevention and wellness. So these are all the different trainings for training doctors, but also training the patients, but also treating patients, and also giving the doctors new tools to be able to explore what's possible for new healing modalities that are emerging with XR. So training for high-stakes scenarios. This is a piece by BioFlight VR. I did this experience where I was thrown into an emergency room with a baby who was dying, a virtual baby, and it was turning purple. And there was a mother that was right there screaming at me to save her baby, and I needed to figure out what to do to save the baby. And I'm not a doctor, and I have no idea what to do. So it's extremely stressful to have to know, like, what are the things that I need to do to be able to come out of the situation. The point being is that sometimes there's these larger contextual dimensions that when you're put into a training scenario, this is something that VR can do that simulates that, and it might be something that doesn't happen very often, but people still need to know how to react, and there's nothing like being put into a simulation of that experience to be able to know what you need to do. But also Skip Rizzo has been able to do like PTSD exposure therapy, and so if VR can help people heal from trauma, it can also invoke different aspects of trauma. So you can go in a virtual experience and have your trauma triggered. So it's important to be aware of that, to have trigger warnings, but also to understand how to design so that you're maybe not unconsciously putting people in situations that are going to be potentially traumatizing for folks. Okay, resources, money, and values. This gets into different things like interoperability and open standards. There's a lot of things that are happening with trying to create the open metaverse and all the different standards that are happening. There's a lot of actual really great work that's happening in the Metaverse Standards Forum, so that it's not just being controlled by companies, but actually that it's kind of democratized in a certain way. So a lot of real progress that's happening there. Access to XR technology is a huge thing. The Google Cardboard was probably one of the most accessible technologies, but support was dropped, and talking to some folks here, even like the iPhone sort of deprecated different aspects of the player within YouTube so that it stopped working. And so it's a little bit unfortunate that some of the biggest potential for XR is in education, but that's where there's not a lot of money, and the technologists aren't necessarily prioritizing that as a use case, unfortunately. So virtual gift economies that are happening, where people are kind of openly creating and sharing things in these virtual worlds, happening a lot within the context of worlds like AnyWorld and VRChat, just creating experiences for people to have with no intention for economic return. But things like VRChat do have ways to subscribe. So is this a new business model that goes above and beyond surveillance capitalism that can sort of overcome some of the different limitations, where people actually are paying for the experiences that they have? Or like Roblox and Fortnite and other experiences like Rec Room, where you're actually buying like virtual skins and avatar representation as a primary mode for how people are making money in these virtual worlds. And there's also the platform aspect of the app stores for both Apple and Google and Meta are all taking 30% cut of all these different experiences as they're being delivered. And so there's a kind of a tax that's happening where the platform holders are really both profiting for all these different works, but it's at some point, is that going to happen forever? I mean, things like Facebook and Amazon were on the web, and there was not a 30% tax that Tim Berners-Lee put on that. So there's a whole wide innovation that happened because of that open internet approach. And so, but right now we're in this kind of real things are being controlled and owned by these platform holders. They already have a lot of control, and as things move forward, they're going to have even more control as things progress. And also surveillance capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, all the ways that all the data that are included in these different experiences, how much are they going to continue to feed into the surveillance capitalism machine? So this is a big section on self-biometric identity to unpack that just a little bit. Neurotechnology is something that's happening with both all these different forms of being able to measure different things that are radiating from your body, to be able to detect what's happening with your brainwaves and what you're thinking. And all that's being fed into how the experiences are being created. But at the same time, all that data can be used to identify all these different things about you. So there's some pretty fundamental existential threats to privacy. And if there's anything where law needs to come in and start to define some of these things, this is the area that is probably the biggest area that needs the most help from the lawyers and the policy folks to be able to put in some protections, because right now it's kind of the Wild West and there are no protections, and it's going to be like we're sleepwalking into a dystopia as we continue to move forward. So just as an example, psychographic inferences from eye gaze data. So just being able to track your eyes, you can start to infer different information like gender, age, geographic origin, physical health, biometric identity, cultural background, mental health states, personality traits, skills and abilities, level of sleepiness, drug consumption, mental overload, and cognitive processes. These are all qualities and characteristics that these companies are going to be able to determine just by being able to track your eyes. But that's not the only data they have. They're correlating that to all sorts of other information as well. So, for me, like Meta has these non-invasive neural interfaces where you put this watch on your wrist and it's got electromyography, which is detecting your fingers moving, but they can start to detect the firing of an individual motor neuron. So that means that I could put my finger here and not even move it. I can just think that I want to move my finger. And that process of thinking that I want to move my finger actually triggers the technology to take action. So this is something that's a whole new realm of possibilities for what that's going to mean for human-computer interface, just being able to type at incredible speeds. This is a prototype technology that still needs to diffuse out in the world, and still an open question as to whether or not we're just going to use computer vision to be able to do that rather than this detection. But this could be the future of human-computer interaction as we're kind of slightly moving our hands around and be able to engage with technology. But just to be able to detect the intent to move is something that also can be quite scary. When you start to add it into things like active presence and technology being able to track your behaviors, your intention, your actions, your movements, your mental thoughts, cognitive processes, cognitive load, social presence, your affective state, emotional sentiment, facial expressions, micro-expressions, and your stress, arousal, physiological reactions, eye gaze and attention, body language, and muscle fatigue. This is a list of all the different things that the technology companies will be able to track here within the next 5 to 10 years, or even right now. And be able to potentially feed that into experiences to make the experiences better, but also to feed it into their surveillance capitalism machines to be able to understand and psychographically profile you in new ways. And what's the full extent of that? And then VR is looking at something from inside, and then the AR is all these sensors facing outwards. And so there's the idea of bystander privacy, that as you start to track all the people around you, you're able to essentially extrapolate all those same things. And so there's both the inward, but also the bystander aspect of the AR. That's also going to be, as we move forward, how do we deal with these technologies where you didn't even consent, but these technology companies could be getting all this information on you. So that's why Anita Farahany starts to declare these fundamental human rights of both self-determination and freedom of thought and mental privacy, which she includes the physiological reactions and affective reactions. And there's also so in her book, The Battle for Your Brain, she's trying to defend the right to think freely in the age of neurotechnology. So XR and neurotech, all of this stuff is sort of moving forward in the future where it's sort of the Wild West where there's no regulations for the companies to limit what they can do with all this stuff. And so she's proposing to have a new human right called cognitive liberty that is encompassing all of these things of self-determination, freedom of thought, mental privacy. And that needs to go to the human rights level at the UN and be able to work out and then kind of feed out into how technology is being produced. There's also a whole movement of neuro rights that is trying to define the right to mental privacy, the right to identity, the right to agency, the right to fair access to mental augmentation, and the right to be protected from algorithmic bias. So this is sort of a separate but parallel effort that is more driven by neuroscientists, where Anita Farahany is more of a neuroscientist, a philosopher, and a law professor who's trying to tie all these things together. So I really like what Anita Farahany's doing, and I think there's a lot of stuff that's going to need to happen at this human rights level, at the laws, the regulations, at the EU, and then eventually in the United States to be able to set some regulations for what you can and cannot do to be able to protect our cognitive liberty as we move forward. Because for me, that's the biggest threat for all these technologies as we move forward. All right, so back to the sort of identity. There's all these different avatar for representation for identity. And then you need to have a diverse selection of avatars. If you do have a social VR, then making sure that there's enough diversity that's represented in all these different experiences. And then there's these photorealistic codec avatars that Meta has that has a very high resolution depiction of you, which if anyone saw an interview with Mark Zuckerberg and Lex Friedman, where they were having a conversation using a MetaQuest Pro. So they kind of get it to the point where you can use a technology that's tracking all your face and your eyes, but then translate it into a very photorealistic depiction of you. Which, there's a whole issue of deepfakes in AI. What happens if someone gets a hold of that and starts to spoof your identity? What happens if they get a hold of your voice? Then to what degree are these authorized, or that they're verified that they're actually you? So we're in this sort of world where people can start to potentially spoof your identity in these virtual contexts in a way that is even potentially even more extreme than what we can do in physical reality, because it's really difficult to fake what you look like in these different worlds. But in the virtual world, it could be a little bit easier. There's also this phenomenon of Snapchat dysmorphia, where facial filters are causing some folks to want to actually have, to change their physical appearance and have surgeries to be able to match more closely to these versions of the self that they're seeing from these facial filters. So what degree are these facial filters really changing our sense of identity, our sense of self? And then consciousness hacking, which on one end has this dimension where you want to be able to hack your own consciousness to be able to live into the potential that you want, but you don't want other people to hack your consciousness. So how do you prevent that from happening? David Eagleman has sensory substitution, where you can actually turn your torso into an ear. Really wild stuff where you can start to replace different senses by having different modes, and different XR technologies that can do that through haptic vests and whatnot, but also add new senses by putting something on your foot and being able to detect where true north was, just because there's a technology that's giving you these feedback. So you add new senses as we move forward. Okay, early education, communication. We have telepresence, being in social co-presence with other people. You have data visualization, new ways that we're going to be able to visualize all this information, and new sense-making possibilities with a spatial understanding of being able to interact with data in a spatial context. Early education, all the ways that these immersive experiences can start to enhance this experiential dimension and give much more engagement to these different educational contexts. And then the minimum age of 13, they actually sort of shifted it a little bit, but there's two things here. One is that there was fears that the technology would actually impair people's sight as they're developing, because it could versus accommodation conflict make people not actually perceive depth properly, but also COPPA compliance, which is that privacy laws, they can't collect data information on kids who are less than 13. So there's other implications there. Okay, then the home, family, and private property. Just having the ability to capture volumetric memories that you're sharing with other people, and also different ways to connect to the Earth, Google Earth VR, being able to travel anywhere in the world and create new relationships to the world around us. And then volumetric privacy, as you're having all these different things on your face, what's it mean to be able to actually start to be capturing all these different worlds around us? And then going back to the Ego 4D from Meta, where they want to be able to track what happened when, what will I do next, what am I doing now, who said what when, and how we're interacting. All these things that's on their technological agenda, and how do you actually sort of fight against that if you don't want anything to happen, if you're a bystander that you don't want to have Meta know what you're going to say next, and you're part of a conversation. So what's the consent model as we move forward into these spatial computing models that actually has everybody agree that they actually want to have this happening with contextually aware AI? And then other partnerships, you have everything from going on virtual dates. Joe Hunting did a whole documentary that was on HBO called We Met in Virtual Reality. So there's the capability to go on dates, but there's also what is the dimension of intimacy when it comes to interactions when you're with people in the virtual context. So partners may have to have new negotiations and rules for what's okay or not okay for what types of things that people do in a virtual context. And then VR as an empathy machine is probably one of the biggest excitements, but also pushbacks that I've seen in the industry, where Chris Milk gave this famous talk at TED in 2015, exalting the potentials for how VR is going to be an empathy machine, which actually came from Roger Ebert talking about film. Roger Ebert said that film is an empathy machine. But then the pushback is, well, you can't have an empathy dictated by a technology or a machine. It's something that's a fundamental relational dynamic, but also it's sometimes very problematic when you have sort of folks from a certain background going into these marginalized places and doing trauma tourism, and then starting to broadcast this information and not have the people that they're featuring a part of the storytelling process. And you just have this kind of story colonialism that can happen that can be very problematic. So there's a lot of tension there between the potentials of empathy, but also doing it in a way that's in right relationship to the people, in a way that the stories that are being told actually include the people in a way that there's nothing about us without us. Then virtual harassment and bullying is a huge part of anything on virtual online. What are the ways that people are harassing each other in these virtual contexts, and how do you start to either have code of conducts or technologies to help mitigate some of those different aspects? And then again, marginalized communities are often disproportionately harassed. So folks who are marginalized are often the ones that are at the brunt of all these different aspects of harassment. So really listening to their experiences and making sure that the technology is preventing the folks who are the most vulnerable. Okay, then death, collective resources. You have grief rituals, so people exploring different aspects of grieving and having, like this is a virtual reality experience that was exploring someone who died by suicide, really telling that story, really emotionally moving. And then funerals. AltSpace VR was a platform from Microsoft that shut down. And what were the ways that the community came together to grieve the fact that this platform was closing? And then virtual violence, what's it mean to be embodied in these virtual bodies and start acting out different modes of violence, actually choking people or killing people or shooting people. There's a whole different dimension when you have an embodied reaction versus a 2D representation where you have some sort of psychological distance when you're actually in a virtual reality and you're actually taking those embodied actions. Then is there something that's different, both ethically, morally, and psychologically? And then philosophy, higher education, and law. Training is one of the biggest killer apps of VR, being able to actually be embedded in some of these different location contexts and to actually take the embodied actions is really powerful for training. And then I see a lot of interdisciplinary features that are happening with VR, breaking down different aspects of academic silos, being able to comprehend complexity and the relation dynamics in new and different ways. And then the human rights laws and regulations. I went to a whole seminar on existing law and extended reality, trying to see what new laws are needed to address some of these different issues. Privacy is probably the biggest one, but there may be other aspects that, especially with the EU, the Digital Service Act, that start to play out how these are impacting these big social networks as we move forward. There's the whole idea of speculative world building. You can build worlds that don't exist. And you can see what it's like, and then maybe it encourages people to actually go out and make those worlds in physical reality. There's a big trend of indigenous futurism where I see a lot of indigenous creators be able to use the medium to be able to explore their own culture, their own more relational ontologies, and their own myths. There's a piece that was called This Is Not a Ceremony that was at Sundance a couple of years ago, really powerful piece. And then Afrofuturism is another piece of this is a piece called Neurospeculative Afrofeminism, where they wanted to have like a hair salon where people go in and get the latest like neurotechnologies from like your hairdressers, and just to create this in the context of a Black business and Black women who were helping lead these different immersive adventures and neurotechnologies. So this was a piece that was at Sundance back in 2017. Future Dreaming had Sutu was working with Aboriginal youth in Australia to be able to have them create immersive experiences for where they wanted to be in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years. And so I got to see what kind of things these Aboriginal youth wanted to do in the future. And then just creating these senses of wonder and awe, really blowing your mind for what's possible. David Chalmers argues that VR is a genuine reality, so that it's actually not a real reality, but it's actually a genuine reality that is just like any other reality. And I sort of briefly mentioned that before, but I think that there's also this kind of fundamental paradigm shift philosophically that I see this kind of move towards more process relational thinking rather than the more kind of substance-based static ways of thinking. And then what is truth? What is reality? This is obviously a big topic from misinformation, disinformation, fake news, malinformation. There was a piece that was at IFA-DACLA back in 2019 that Richard Nixon had created a speech of what happened if the first Apollo had crashed on the moon. He would come out and give a speech, and so they actually recreated Nixon giving the speech. So you're sitting there with a newspaper, totally manufactured, this didn't actually happen, but just this idea that you could start to create alternative realities that don't exist. What's that mean to be, when people experience these, to what degree that they think that this is actually happening? Okay, last three, career government institutions. You have Spatial design, lots of different architects are using this to explore the ways that we're exploring space. Virtual screens for productivity, lots of folks with these mixed reality headsets sitting there being able to do lots of work. And then workplace attention monitoring is something that Nita Farahani put on. If people have these immersive technologies, what happens when your employer can start to detect what you're paying attention to, if you have different dimensions of cognitive load, what is private and what is available to be shared with your workplace? That's going to be a big battle as we start to have newer technologies interface with the workplace. And then governmental mass surveillance. It's one thing for Facebook or Meta to be surveilling us, but what happens when you have TikTok or that's working with CCP or even with the US government and the third-party doctrine? To what degree do all this information is that can be fed into this mass surveillance from the government context, which is also a concern. Then the last two, friends, community, collective culture. You have just people gathering together from different communities of practice, coming in different gatherings. The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker is a great book to be able to explore what's it mean to gather, especially in these virtual spaces. So hanging out with friends. And algorithm bias is a piece that gets into what are the limitations of artificial intelligence to be able to track faces. And sometimes the training data set doesn't always include everybody in a population. So folks who are, again, marginalized communities may actually be disproportionately affected, which is a big reason why the AI Act in the European Union was trying to come up with a policy for AI, which I think personally is at least 3 to 5 to 10 years ahead for where we are here in the United States. So if you really want to see where the future of legislation is with the AI, look to the AI Act, because they created a whole tiered system of things that are unacceptable risk. These are banned different applications of AI. Then you have things that are high risk, limited risk, and minimal risk. There's different reporting obligations for the high risk and limited risk, but essentially they're trying to create different tiers of harm that can happen from these AI technologies, and given those harms, then what are the reporting obligations for these companies? And then finally, you have combining isolation for folks to be able to be connected through these immersive technologies. Accessibility, that's a huge topic. I did a whole 14-part series at XR Access talking to blind and low vision folks and deaf and hard of hearing folks, and how are these folks with these disabilities being left behind currently, and what needs to happen with the technology to be able to fully be inclusive for everyone. And that's sort of an ongoing conversation, especially with the phone technologies. They're using AI to actually increasing accessibility, but with the immersive technologies, they don't have the same type of things that the phone has, although the Apple Vision Pro is integrating it. But the existing systems with both Unity, Unreal Engine, and Meta are like way, way behind from where even phones are when it comes to just the basic accessibility. So that was a little bit of a tour, the promises and perils of extended reality. And for me, it's ultimately you're able to connect to yourself, to connect to others, to connect to the planet, and to connect to all levels of reality for what these technologies are going to mean, both XR and AI and all these things all together. And we talked a little bit about the experiential design, immersive storytelling framework, and also some of the promises and perils of XR. And so with that, I'll sort of open it up for any questions that you may have. So thank you.
Got time for just a couple questions. Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kent. So this is more than thought. I'm curious about what your thoughts are about realism, futurism, and also escapism. And we see the development happening in virtual. The Horizon World is Meta platform where they are doing escapism and futurism. And there's NVIDIA and the movement going on creating a digital twin, like an exact replica of what we are witnessing in the planet Earth. So how do we create a law or a monitoring system at humanitarian level, connecting to your second part of the presentation, when we will have these two different levels of virtual activity going on, and also augmented and mixed reality that will soon be released.
Yeah, I mean, I think the roles of the platforms and the policies they have are right now sort of disproportionately impacting what happens at the large scale, but there's also a lot of stuff that's happening from the grassroots that is much more unregulated. I will say, like with social media, you have like a text, a video, or picture that is posted that you could do content moderation. And we're moving into a time where it's more about experiences and conversations and more about conduct moderation as we move forward. And that's a whole other thing, that there isn't like a artifact of an expression that can be reflected in the same way, which means that we're kind of moving into this more experiential mode of thinking, which actually is difficult to control. There's code of conduct that a lot of these companies are saying, if you violate these codes of conduct, then you can be banned. But then the enforcement is a whole other thing. So you see things like Rec Room starting to detect with AI what people are saying to see if there's like things that are like more in the harassment or abuse. So that's more of a trust and safety context. I think some of the things you may be talking about is maybe a deeper philosophical thing that is a higher level that I don't know if anybody can sort of wrap their heads around. We can talk more offline about some of these different things. But yeah, that's some just initial thoughts, that it's really kind of the Wild West and it's difficult to really control. So there's a lot of experimentation that's happening, a lot of innovation, but also a lot of harm and abuse that is difficult to even wrap your mind around. So that we're kind of in that phase of move fast and break things, honestly, where we're kind of pushing forward into this new reality without fully understanding all the implications of it.
Is there any like screen time limits that they're adding to any of these things that will help prevent like even younger children that are using it that are like 13, because they need that like interaction with other people rather than isolating and staying online? Is there a screen time limit that's added to any of these technologies?
So Tristan Harris was a big advocate for adding some of the screen time things to the mobile platforms. But a lot of that stuff is at the operating system at both the Apple and Android. But the Android version that Meta's using is really quite a big fork that doesn't include a lot of that yet. They're adding more parenting features to be able to, you can say, watch what if you have a child, you can see what they're seeing. So you can monitor things. But that also requires a parent to kind of babysit their kid in a way. And there's also people that use VR to babysit their kids and they are not there. So there's like this kind of tension there. But yeah, that's something that they might potentially add. But right now, with Apple has a much tighter integration with what's happening with their operating system, with iOS, which is going to be integrating, let's say, lots more accessibility features with Apple Vision Pro. So it'll be easier for Apple to start to integrate that, but their starting price for Apple Vision Pro is like $3,500. So it's going to be a few years before that's even accessible for most consumers. But I put a lot more faith in how Apple's going to handle a lot of these things than how Meta has been handling, because you can look to science fiction to see how like Ready Player One was like this vision of everybody's in a game, and that's really how Meta is approaching it. But Apple, they don't even say virtual augmented reality, they say spatial computing, because they want it to be this whole other thing that's more focused on mixed reality and being able to use like all the different applications that are on your phone to be able to have access and have a spatial dimension within XR. So they're taking a completely different tact for trying to bring in all those different things that are happening on a phone base, more the mental social presence or the utility that we have on our phone, and start to bring those applications in. Whereas Meta and Google have had a lot of like battles, let's say, where Google hasn't opened up the keys of the kingdom to be able to bring all these Android apps onto the same platform. So it'll be interesting to see how things develop over time.
Barbara?
Yes, hi, Barbara Kay from University of Tennessee. Thank you so much. I mean, this is really amazing. I mean, the topics that you brought up, it's like my pea brain is still trying to grapple with all this. But my question is, how do we bring this into the classroom to enhance our students' interest and understanding of any topic?
Yeah, well, there's actually going to be a session about that tomorrow where folks have been doing that with 360 video primarily, I think. 360 video is the easiest onboarding way of doing that. Google used to have a thing called Google Expeditions where they had lots of different immersive experiences where you could go into, and they tried to create it to be agnostic to what the curriculum was. So you could use the same immersive experience for kindergartners and for high schoolers theoretically, but have the teaching around it be different. So there's something that is nice in the future where education can start to open up these new vistas. So there's a couple of things that are blocking it. One is the access to the technology. It's very expensive. MetaQuest Pro just launched, and base price is like $500. There used to be Google Cardboard, and so there's still some functionality that you can use that is just the $20, and then put your phone in there, and you can have an immersive experience. There's tons of content on YouTube that's 360 video, but Apple has kind of deprecated some of those different features to work easily. And there's also platforms like Engage. Well, so there's existing applications for chemistry that are out there. There are applications to do labs. There's educational tours, and KayXR is a specific company that has been focusing specifically on creating tours for especially Black youth and marginalized communities, and kind of trying to give access to these different things, different experiences that would not be easily accessible. But there's also Engage XR, which is where a lot of, let's say, higher education, different types of social dynamics are happening. Jeremy Bailenson is a communications professor at Stanford who has been doing a lot of research with what's it mean to bring people into a virtual environment and to be able to explore different things. And so a lot of research from Jeremy Bailenson has been starting to do that. So I'd say as the technology develops, there's more platforms to make it easier to make content, but it's been very difficult to learn how to use Unity and Unreal Engine and all these game engine platforms. It takes people that are from the game design world to do that, but with 360 video, it's a lot easier to kind of shim these experiences just by capturing different aspects of reality. And on YouTube, there's a ton of different 360 video content that you could potentially start to use as a baseline.
Is this like free? I mean, do I have to pay for it? Can we just put it in our campus site?
Well, the technology is not free. You have to have at least access to the technology.
Well, that's the end of that.
But there is actually a ton of content that's free, that's on YouTube, and stuff that's available for free for download. Different universities that have been doing different experimentations. University of Michigan's been doing a lot of stuff with their students. I've done talks that are online that are specifically addressing what's happening across a different industry sector for education that you can start to see. Some different disciplines are further along than others because, say like architecture or anthropology, there's different techniques for volumetric capture that are being developed. And even new cutting edge techniques like Gaussian splatting and neural radiance fields, which is essentially ways of doing volumetric capture of spaces that can be rendered in more near real time than existing processes. So that just released like a couple months ago. So I expect to see, and there's Sketchfab, and there's different cultural institutions that have been putting objects on like Sketchfab for free to download and to be able to put in different immersive experiences. So there's certainly a content ecosystem that's out there, but it's difficult to point you to one application based upon whatever your context is. But there is resources, but like I said, most of the XR has been focused on gaming and make sure it works for gaming. And then because of the economic situation where there's not a business proposition where you're making a lot of money in education, it means that most of the people who are doing education are driven by passion and love for the idea, and rather than profiting. So there's less of it, and also Meta has been curatorially not emphasizing that as much because they want to move towards gaming. So
let me build on that. Tomorrow, room 321 is going to have multiple setups that have a variety of VR software that's used in education, so you can see examples from different fields. Plus, we have some sessions, not only use of 360 video, but use of VR in teaching. So we have a whole track tomorrow morning, but there's a chance for hands-on room 321. So Kent will be with us all day tomorrow.
Yeah,
So-
I'll be here tomorrow and Saturday, and if anybody wants to come, talk about whatever you're doing or any feedback or any insights, if you're working in XR or if you just want to talk about media theory or anything that came up, happy to do interviews. I'll be here doing interviews tomorrow and then on Saturday morning.
I noticed you got the recorder going. Is this going
Yeah.
to be another podcast?
It might be a video for my
Might be
Patreon,
good.
yeah.
One other thing I think that just blew me away, the citations. in your presentation. You had one of the most deeply cited presentations I've ever seen. I personally want to thank you for that.